Welcome, BJ. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on Survival of the Kindest. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Do you want to just to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Morning, Julian, or good evening for you, pal, I guess. It
Yeah.
is a pleasure to be here. So, I am BJ Miller. I am a hospice and palliative medicine physician. Um, I guess I hesitate on that word because in some ways I'm not really practicing clinical palliative care in some ways, but we'll talk about that. But yes, I'm a hospice and palliative medicine physician and I suppose educator. I'm talking to you from here in Northern California, my home in Mill Valley, California. So I started this go around in Chicago. I was born downtown Chicago, and then my family we migrated through suburbia and landed in a little snooty suburb called Winnetka, Illinois. I was there for much of my childhood, but in between there, we moved around a lot. Moved to St. Louis, to El Paso, Texas, Roswell, New Mexico, back to St. Louis, back to the Chicago area, all by the time I was done with grade school. So we moved around a lot, which was a big part of my early experience. I think that did a lot for me, actually. Well, especially as a sort of a, especially spending so much time in suburbia. In the Midwest, there's a certain genericness to it. There's a certain whiteness to it. There's a certain scale to it. And so moving around the country at a young age, the thing that impressed me most, I think, was the changing landscape. And I think it's where I kind of fell in love with my own country in a way, because I actually kind of fell in love with the soil, the, the geography, the topography of this place. And so that was really eye opening for me, is to see the Southwest, the desert, Texas at a young age. That really impressed me. And then seeing different shapes and sizes of people, of course, helped me at a young age, just to know, just to set the tone that not everyone looks like you, not everyone has the things you do. That basic kind of stuff, which was good for a young mind. Yep. Mhm. 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 Yes. Right on. Right on. And what I'm trying, yes, I have definitely seen myself in that school, or try to be, and the refinement here is no, I'm not interested in relinquishing my medical training per se or that valuable medical lens. What I'm trying to do is I feel like I'm in a position to straddle some of these lines that otherwise throw people into two different camps. Like you're either in the doctor world or you're anything else. Or, I'm trying to kind of straddle these lines and not abdicate the medical piece, but to keep it in its place. And that seems really
Absolutely,
important.
absolutely. So tell us about the Zen Hospice project.
Yeah, so that was a fascinating place. I mean, so I had heard about that in medical school. I remember in passing. It's an old institution in San Francisco that grew out of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. And the San Francisco Zen Center had this old Victorian. And as was happening in the late 80s in San Francisco and elsewhere, the medical establishment was really falling on its face, was dramatically failing people with HIV and AIDS for all sorts of reasons. It was a very difficult time, and medicine was not rising to the occasion, at least to start. And so patients, people who were cast out by virtue of being homosexual or IV drug users already, they were, and then finding that they couldn't get help. And so folks were dying of AIDS on the street and showing up on the doorsteps of religious organizations in hopes of being taken in. I mean, this is going anywhere but the hospital, essentially. So the San Francisco Zen Center repurposed an old Victorian it had for this purpose, to take folks in towards the end of life. Initially with their own members who were dying of cancer, but increasingly the general population was dealing with HIV. And so that's how it started, and it made its way much in the same way as Stephen Levine's model, or that he would have been very at home at a place like Zen Hospice Project. It was volunteer run. It was coming from a spiritual practice, a Zen practice underneath that was underneath all the trainings of the organization, as a way, like we were saying earlier, a way of sitting and being with suffering, being with pain, and not running away. That was the central tenet to their Zen practice. So here they were practicing at the bedside of people who were dying. They were experiencing impermanence very directly this way. And so the place evolved over the years as this under the radar, beautiful hospice home, hospice in philosophy, but not licensed per se. It didn't take insurance. It wasn't affiliated with it. It didn't have a license, actually. So anyway, it developed in this sort of below the radar, human way, spiritual way. Then they had to close because all that caught up with them, and they didn't have a license, et cetera. And the city cracked down, and they had to close. And it took a few years to think about whether they wanted to get a license and reopen. And they did. And I heard about that reopening and that they were looking for a director. So I applied for the job. They weren't looking for an MD. They didn't want an MD. That was a very interesting part of the experience there. That's why I was making a point to say I'm going to straddle these lines, because otherwise these two camps can be at each other a little bit. There was deep suspicion of the medical model among the Zen hospice community, and well founded. But I think you also dispense with medicine at your own peril too. So I entered that place trying to find a new day where we weren't falling into these two camps, but we were finding a singular camp where everything or everyone was welcome. That was the effort. Um, anyway, we could say there's a lot more to say about Zen Hospice, but so I was there for 5 years working on that model, trying to protect what Zen Hospice was at its core as a spiritual and humanistic place, and while layering in the medical piece on top. And that was a beautiful, beautiful, important experience. There's much more to say about it, but I should stop before I keep going on too long.
No, no, I'm interested in that, and in particular, I mean, I think people, just for our listeners, when you use the word Zen, it conjures up all kinds of images. But Zen, I guess, is a part of Mahayana Buddhism, which the foundation of which is, if you like, the recognition of suffering and compassion as the basis for how one moves through the world and all worlds, how one deals with, in particular, how one deals with one's life. So it seems quite natural to me that if people are turning up on the door looking for a place for support in the context of, particularly around HIV/AIDS and in San Francisco, that seems highly relevant, that the appropriate response from a compassionate perspective is to open the door to these people.
Right.
and let them in and welcome them and look after them as a natural, in a way, a natural expression of who we are as human beings.
Right
I
on.
guess, and it sounds like that's what you're saying. Over and above a label of Zen, this is a human response to suffering,
That's
which
right.
we all carry this potential. Yeah,
That's right. And that's really important to say. Hey, you are a very good listener, Julian. That's exactly spot on. And that's also was a source of tension in there, it must be said, because there was a big part of folks there who believed, who were there to practice. They were there in some ways that sometimes there were moments where it felt like the place was really devoted more to the practice of to the Zen practice than to the patient's well-being on some level. What a weird, ironic statement, and nonetheless totally true and palpable, and really tricky. So it was exactly.
just.
I know. There again, brother, that is the exactly right response. I mean, that's exactly the right
Oh
response.
man, I just got this image of uh, of people wandering around in this kind of serene haze when there's suffering going on, and
Yes,
look how serene I can be
yes,
amongst this suffering. So-
yes. That is not far off. I mean, it was really, and it
Ah,
took me a
brilliant.
while to figure that out. And you realize, wow, that place, there was so much going on in that little building with 6 beds. And what you just described so perfectly, that too was part of the mix. There were some folks who saw the problems with that, but everyone was in their own journey. Everyone, and it was a place trying to hold all these simultaneous journeys happening. And in some ways, it was beautiful, and in some ways, it was a chaotic mess. It was many,
Yeah,
many things. So, but that what you just the irony that you just described ultimately, um, Zen Hospice did have to close. Actually, that the guest house had to close and sell a few years ago. The organization still exists. It's now called the Zen Caregiving Project, and they exist now to train volunteers in their approach, and it's beautiful. But that tension that we were just describing did take its toll on the place, and ultimately it had to close its doors.
yeah. Did you did you try and address that? I can see that there's
Mhm,
always that delicate place of rocking the boat to bring about being
mhm.
the disruptive innovator, but not rocking it so much that the boat falls over. I can imagine that must have been quite a tricky balance.
It was an extraordinarily tricky balance. Those were some of the hardest 5 professional years or 5 years of my professional life. And a lot of these things weren't named. Like you sort of sense these things happening, but no one was talking about it. And I was a visitor because I was a medical guy, and there was suspicion around that I was coming from the outside. I'm not a Zen practitioner per se. I'm a doctor. Like two strikes against me per se. So I was a controversial figure just walking through the door. The whole thing was just so wild, so wild, and took me a couple years to even figure out what I was sensing. For the first couple of years, I was just crazy making because I would see all this beautiful stuff happening, but also have this sinking feeling that there was something very problematic going on too that wasn't really named. And it was wild. It was really tricky. Yeah, and I did try to reconcile these things. I did try to talk about these things to some degree, and that was and the place and we were hitting a stride with it. There was a new conversation happening. We were welcoming new people into the mix. It was important to keep it a secular organization. The board had decided that that was important. So we were cracking it open. Things were happening. Partnerships were setting into place. But ultimately, it was too heavy a lift. Not so much from the in, like the in. We're touching on some of the inner turmoil of the place, of the culture of the place, which is important part of the story. But it's not why the doors closed. The doors closed because there is no funding model. There's no model, the self-sufficient model for these little hospice houses in the US health system. There is no insurance will not pay for this kind of care. There is no place in the policies for these kinds of little mom and pop sweet little homes. So it closed because the fabric of society and the policies of civil society didn't really allow for such a place. That's really why it closed, not so much the inner turmoil that we're talking about.
So this now is fascinating, and we might spin off in a different direction. We'll see where it
Mhm,
goes.
mhm,
I'm curious about this. So in the UK, um, palliative care, the roots of palliative care have come from hospices, and the and for the most part, they came out of uh, good-willed Christian communities
mhm,
that they were seen as part of their religious duty. And I think it created something of a similar dilemma that you were talking about from Zen Hospice. But nevertheless, that the funding model has always been third sector, and even palliative care grew as a specialty, and some funding has gone toward hospices, and as we know, medicine's not for profit practice for profit in the UK. So it's possible to direct some funds from government towards palliative care, and it's grown as a specialty. And so that mixture of charitable donations and state funding has continued. But the funding model of healthcare in the US is very, very different, and not one that I understand well, and also, coming from being embedded in a national health service and free healthcare at the point of contact, uh, uh, I I fail to understand how that works in the US. So,
mhm,
and we have listeners from all over the world, and it would be, and we've not spoken about this on the podcast before, but it would be really good to try and understand that. And where does Medicare, Medicaid fit in? What does Obamacare mean? That kind of stuff, because it, it seems like there's a really interesting central question to this, which is all about compassion
mhm,
and people with terminal illnesses and looking after those people. And how is that done? And there is something much more important than money about that. And you
mhm,
just use the money, like if I'm talking like my own feelings about this now, you just use the money to direct it towards, goodness sake, everyone
mhm,
is going to die. Show me someone who hasn't died. That'd be really
mhm,
interesting. Like, oh, like you
mhm,
make it to 100, you're doing really well. You might even make it to 110. After that, it's finished. So, and
mhm.
nobody nobody gets out of it alive. So it's
Right on.
applicable to everyone. So why don't we just do something with that? And so I've talked a lot now. I'm going to ask you. I'm just going to dump all those difficult questions to you. How does healthcare work in the US?
Well, here, I got an easy answer for you. It doesn't. It doesn't
Okay.
work. It doesn't work. It really doesn't. And the hope is that that is an open secret now, and so bleedingly obvious to whether you're a patient or a provider in this system, that now maybe begrudgingly will begin to actually shift in earnest. Who knows? But that's the hope. But to back up a little bit to get out from under that easy answer, I think there are a few things you need to understand to grok American healthcare. I mean, one is just let yourself off the hook. I don't know even healthcare economists who understand the entirety of the health system. It's such a behemoth. It's so complicated. There's so much money sloshing around in it. There's so little transparency around data. There's so much not understood even by the experts, the policy experts. So one is to say, go easy on yourself trying to fully understand it. And second, to say, a couple of things I think that are really central. One is there's a schism, a bright line in the American healthcare system between medical services and social services. And that it's telling. Like we have, like you'd said earlier, the system, it's the way it's structured, et cetera, is all oriented around the payers and the providers. The patients are sort of the afterthought in so many ways. This plays out in outrage. It's ridiculous, and it plays out in so many different ways. Whether it's like my mom, as a person using a wheelchair, how many exam rooms, how many clinics were inaccessible to wheelchairs. Like she couldn't get in to see her doctor in her wheelchair. What the fuck is that? I mean, that's just insane. So there's
Yeah.
examples like that all over the place. So, so one here is that the medic, so it's oriented around the provider's experience. So it's doctors rule everything. The medical lens is the dominant lens. They're all knowing, and then everything is sort of lesser. And social services are this orphan thing over to the side, have their own policies, their own structures, their own offices. So there's this weird bright line between social services and medical services, which as a patient make no sense. It's not like you're divided into your social issues, your medical issues, but the system doesn't see that. And this is why our emergency rooms are stuffed filled with people who are there for social reasons, if you had to say, not purely disease oriented issues. And this whole fantasy that we could separate the diseases as the focus of our work from the people that are living with the disease. That's another major central flaw in the design of American healthcare. So two things so far. One is the schism between medical and social services. The other is this idea that we're really actually focused on the disease, not the person living with the disease. Those two things show up in all sorts of ways. A third line item to understanding the American healthcare system is how what gets paid. Traditionally, it's a fee for service private enterprise. So if doctors do more procedures, do more stuff, they have more to bill for, and they get paid more. So all the incentives are to just do more things to people. And as you and I both know, that's very often not the best in the best interest of anybody involved. And yet that's where all the incentives go. So, for my money, those three things can help you kind of begin to understand why the system is as screwed up as it is.
And what does it mean in terms of again, I'm trying to understand this, but because in the UK it's easy. If you're suffering, you can go to the doctor,
Hmm.
and that's it. That's the bottom line.
Hmm.
And if you're ill, you can go to hospital.
Hmm.
Nobody looks to see whether you've got an insurance card before you get into the hospital. How
Hmm.
does that work in the US?
Well, that reminds me of probably one of a fourth thing on the list of sort of beginning to understand American healthcare is it is there's a still it was never conceived of as a right. It has always been conceived of as something in this country that you can, if you can access it, if you can afford it, if you can find your way to getting a job and therefore insurance. And here, health insurance is linked to to your job, not to you being a citizen or a person at all. So healthcare being linked to work, that's already problematic in a lot of ways. Um, but all that is to say, it's an unasked but open question all over the place. Who deserves care in this country? Who's earned their care by working into the system, paying into the system by virtue of having a job, etc. So we don't. That's another piece that's all over this place. We are really not at all sure in this country that we want healthcare to be a right. We're not at all sure of that. So that's. I have an answer to that, but you feel that everywhere around here.
I mean that from my perspective, that sounds utterly bizarre.
Hmm.
I mean, from so there's so many reasons why that's bizarre, and this kind of brings us into compassionate communities,
Hmm.
because in terms of one of the ironies of what you're talking about is that in terms of the most powerful intervention we have, the most powerful intervention is social relationships, compassionate communities.
Hmm.
It's more effective than giving up smoking, drinking, diet, exercise. It's about the people we know and love in the places we know and love. And that keeps us alive longer than any other interventions that we have. If you suffer from loneliness, you have something like a 30% increased risk of death. You might lose 20 years of your life through being lonely. And and
Hmm.
uh, I don't know if you know the work of Julianne Holt-Lunstad. She's done absolutely fantastic work
Hmm.
about the impact of social relationships and mortality. And
What
and
was
for
her
people
name,
on the
Julian?
podcast, Julianne Holt-Lunstad. For people on the podcast, the people who are listening, I interviewed Julian, who's just a totally lovely person and an amazing researcher, and she's part of the forthcoming Elevate Compassion Summit series that's happening on June 17th and 18th. And
Mm,
anyone who wants to book into that, it's a free summit series. We want to make this available to everyone, and just because we feel it's so important, you can
mm,
go to elevatecompassion.org and just book in and be part of it. But social relationships and compassion and compassionate communities is how we express that. And that's very directly related to how we treat the people around us. It's
mm,
completely natural to who we are as human beings. And if people are, you and I will get this completely. If
mm,
people are sick, you want to treat them. They're suffering, let's help relieve their suffering. And it sounds like to lose that very basic, fundamental human component of warmth of heart, it sounds quite odd to me. How like, as a culture and a community, it sounds like I don't know how to express that or explain it other than to say that very simple bit of human nature is, like, kind of
mhm.
gone missing a bit.
Right on.
Would that be right?
Yes, and yes, and it's complicated, of course. There's the another sort of line item in understanding the American healthcare system here would be our history as a this country, people and moving into America's modern history. It's white when the Europeans came to this country and the United States of America as such. So Native people understood this, still understand this better than this new America. But so what I'm talking about is this new America. And this new America is founded on, is populated by people who came here seeking, searching, looking for something else, and building up by their bootstraps and going to some new place and conquering the land. And this is all part of the American myth. And you find it in subtle ways all over the place. So we like to hold that we prize the individual, and to the degree to which that prizing the individual is pitted against prizing the social or the group or the communal, we in the U.S. have always chosen the individual as the thing, and we prize that, and it's all over our mythology, and that's beginning to fly in the face of the just overwhelming data that you lay out. That's just not healthy for you. But in the US, we also love thumbing our nose at any ideas of health too. We love thumbing our nose at nature, is another way of putting it. This We have a really tense relationship with nature in this country. It's one built on tension. We're going to, like I say, conquer the land. It's man versus nature. That's so much part of our thing. So whether nature is illness or whether nature is the truth of the health of communities, we we will see it, we'll wink at it, but we still keep choosing this individual path, come hell or high water, come what may. If I die when I'm 30, that's cool because I'm pursuing this rugged individual thing. It's not about health. It's not about longevity ultimately in so many ways here. That's archaic, that's arcane, it's old, it's fading, but it's at our root in all of our systems. Can you kind of Does that make sense to you, Julian? Can you kind of feel how I'm
Yeah,
going
no,
about it?
I understand what you're saying, and I'm trying to kind of work through it and interpret it. And funnily enough, I've just been doing a presentation, and I have in front of me the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, and it says, everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to
Mhm.
security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in the circumstances beyond his control. And it's such a noble aspiration.
Mhm.
But and I guess the that it's an ideal, and we fall way short here in the UK. But it sounds like that's not something that you're necessarily signed up to in the US either.
Well,
And
no, certainly not in so many ways. Though there may be some evidence that that could be changing. Because the other what's like so many of the things we're talking about here, man, they're complex and they really push. Death does this too, right? It pushes back on false dichotomies, the either ors, and we got to keep
yeah,
finding a way for all of the above. All of it needs to fit. And in this case, the all of the above here is it's also true that you will find, in my experience, some of the kindest human beings on the planet in the U.S. And there, so to otherwise we need to say that too, because otherwise, if we just sort of follow the logical
yeah,
conclusion of our systems, it sounds like
yeah,
a
yeah,
demonic place. And
yeah,
yet, right? And yet, I think it's part of that
yeah,
tension is the individual thing. Like, don't tell man, government, don't mandate, don't tell me how to be kind. I'm a good person. I will find my way to kindness. Thank you very much. You don't have to mandate it. So there's some of that. There's a little bit like don't tell me what to do, and then those same people who are saying don't tell me what to do, give me my individual rights, will then turn around in a self-motivated way, be the sweetest person on the friggin' planet that you'll ever run across. So it
yeah.
sort of depends who's telling you to do what around here.
And I guess that chimes with another ongoing feature of the podcast. Is compassionate communities is really another term for community development, and community
Mhm.
development is very much focused around what's the wealth of communities, and the wealth is not money. The wealth is the people. The wealth is
Mhm.
the goodness that's there, and in particular. A couple of weeks ago, I had on Angela Fell, who is embedded in asset-based community development, which comes out of Chicago and John
Mhm.
McKnight and that kind of work, and it's very much focused on mapping the great things that are happening in communities and sharing and doing all of that, and that she described it perfectly for me. She said, "You can create a map of misery of all the things that are wrong in communities, or you can create a treasure map of
Mhm.
all the stuff that's there, like all
Mhm.
the people and place." And I'm sure that I want to live in a community that has a treasure map that people can explore and find out
Mhm.
about the great things that's going on. And I guess we've been talking about the deficit-based thing rather than all the great
Mhm.
stuff that is
Mhm.
there, that is
Mhm.
fundamental to human beings, about kindness and about how we share
Mhm.
that and how we make best use of it. I mean,
Mhm.
a fascinating discussion, and I guess that um, the issue of the right to carry guns is very much along the lines of what you're talking about individuality, and
Mhm.
I'm going to do it my way, and I don't want to be told what to do. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
I guess the other thing is that that we've had one of our guests has been Frederick Riley of Weave, which are part of the Aspen Institute,
Mm.
and and he was talking about structural racism and about that sense of your independence and people pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And he was saying, but if you haven't got bootstraps to pull yourself up by,
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
it doesn't really work.
Right. Right. And even funnier, I'm sorry to interrupt you, man, that I recently read an article about that phrase and how inane the phrase is in the first place because apparently it was originally used to describe a quixotic undertaking. Like if you're pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, you're not going to pull yourself up. You're going to keep running into you're going to keep pulling on the bottom of your foot. So you're going to pull your knee into your teeth. So there's so much wrong with that phrase. But anyway, or quietly write about that phrase. But anyway, yeah, yeah.
It's this is a great discussion, but I think we should probably think a little bit more about palliative care and where you're going with that. How you see that developing? How does your service run at the moment?
So last year, my partner and I, Sonia, she and I started Mental Health, which I mentioned earlier. Originally, the next thing for us after we got done with the book was we were going to start a big library of resources excuse me, to push back on folks being sort of left to Google their diagnosis, which is now the standard. And then you get all this unfiltered, decontextualized information. So we were going to start a little curated library. That was our idea. But then the COVID hit, and what we realized the world needed direct service, not a library right now. So we retooled and started Mental Health, which is this as a way to make palliative care as accessible as possible. In the U.S., you might find palliative care if you're in San Francisco or New York, but you're going to struggle to find palliative care if you're in other rural parts of the country, the Southeast, Upper Midwest. It's very spotty. It's very unevenly distributed. So we were trying to make this kind of care available and ride the coattails of telehealth and make it more accessible. So we've started this little company. People reach out from anywhere. If you have a smartphone or just a telephone, whatever. No need for a referral. We set it up to be direct pay, which is problematic. But as a starting point, it allowed us to circumvent the structures of healthcare and the insurance world, so we could hang our shingle very quickly. So that's what we're doing, and we're going to build slowly, and eventually we'll find a way to taking health insurance, and eventually we'll find a way to working through employers to pay for this. But right now, it's a sliding scale direct-to-consumer business.
And how's that going?
Beautifully in so many ways. I love it. I mean, it's sort of like, I bet you get this, Julian. Like, we're friends or friends of friends will reach out to you informally, like, hey, my mom's in the hospital. What do I do here or there? And, those I used to have bazillions of those conversations, and I always loved them. They're always, you could quickly be helpful. And people really need that help. And if they can call you and get it real quick, they can make better decisions, and off they go in a better way. And so it's just like a basically formalized that kind of informal process. So it feels really good. Some of our clients, they just need one conversation. They need something to think through. There may be a medical decision they got to make. And sometimes one conversation will do the trick. And we love having a light touch, not being yet another doctor on their long list of appointments they have to go to. This is, people come to us because they want to, and they can use us as little or as much as they like. And that feels great. It feels right size. It feels proportionate. It feels wonderful to have this safe place to talk about everything besides medications, and a safe place. And so I've loved it. I love our sessions. We've got a long way to go to figure out the business and to grow it and to get bigger and to bring more counselors on. How to do that, we're trying to figure out. But in terms of the service itself, Julian, I love it. And I think it's actually been pretty darn helpful for many people.
Yeah, that's great. And what kind of services are you offering? I mean, who's in the business, and what kind of did you have different professionals, or
Yeah.
how does all that work?
So another joy was to make it a fun place to work. So for me, it was so fun to let go of the electronic medical record and all the trappings of the clinic that gum up the experience. So we have an hour without a computer in front of us except to talk through, like you and I are doing now. And it's in a sense pure. And a lot of the people want to come work with us as counselors are interested because of that. They just want to practice their craft absent all the trappings. And so we offer that. So for the providers, the fellow counselors, it's lovely. For the patients, it's lovely. So we're trying to flesh out too the full picture of palliative care. So we have social workers, nurses, chaplains, all of us doing much the same work since we let go of the medical piece. And so a client may reach out to me if they want a little medical overlay, or Dina if they want a chaplaincy overlay, or whatever else. But we're all set up to talk about the same things, much the same work. So people come to us for medical decision making, navigating the healthcare system, communication with their doctors or family issues that come up, care for the caregiver. Most of our clients are caregivers. So they're trying to figure out how to hold down their job, be a good caregiver, all that good stuff, take care of themselves. So we coach them through that experience. Grief counseling we do a lot of, both in anticipatory grief in advance of the loss as well as after. That's a ton of our work. And a lot of folks, interestingly, who wouldn't find palliative care not only because it doesn't exist where they live, but because they're not technically sick. That's the other thing. We make people need to get palliative care in the U.S., you have to be sick. Something has to be wrong. But there's something very beautiful about this care removed from the pathology of illness. So some of our clients aren't really sick. They're what you might call in a sort of an existential crisis, trying to figure out who they are or how to proceed. And oh, I love those guys. Those clients are fascinating. I would never have seen them in my clinic.
Yeah, yeah. It's Libby Salno, who you met actually one time when you were in the
Mm,
UK,
mm,
um, she's a great friend and a collaborator, and she got interested in all of this in through the neighborhood network program in Kerala, which is a kind of massive public health compassionate community network for dying, and the way what there's an incredibly imaginative, inspiring palliative care physician called Suresh Kumar who got all this stuff going, and basically mobilized the communities to look after the people um, who are suffering from illness and around death and dying. And he stimulated a process of microfinancing. So it might be
mm,
even 1 rupee given by a school child will have an impact. And then what happened was that the palliative care services are employed by the community. The funding comes directly from the money raised by the
mm.
community. And of course, when the community's in control, which is the point I'm trying to get to, um, is that you stop having this very artificial line between palliative and non-palliative,
Mhm,
between having a diagnosis of heart failure and being in the terminal phase, because what you have is suffering,
mm,
and it doesn't matter whether the suffering is physical or mental. You respond to that in a way. It kind of goes back to the point we were making about if you develop communities and you develop relationships and you develop trust, the natural thing is to care for people around you. and
mhm,
and one of the curious things of about palliative care is that there's two curious things I'm going to mention now. The first thing is that it's predominantly in the UK about people with cancer. And yet,
mm.
only 25% of the people who die have a diagnosis of cancer. So there's huge inequity, amongst other things, around diagnosis, and also about age, about gender, about race, all of those things. And the
Mhm.
other really, really strange thing about palliative care is that the literature on what living a good life means in the palliative setting, it's not just sparse, it's absent. And what that means is that we don't even ask the question of what a good life is. We just suppose what that means, and then
Mhm.
we apply our services into that. And it sounds
Right
like
on.
you've just gone, right, enough of that. Let's get to what's important, and we'll just deal with the problems that people come up with, and we won't define about who's in and who's out. We'll just welcome the conversation.
Right on. God, I love your synopses, Julian. That is right on. I mean, and that's so beautifully put. And you're also pointing to this dearth of this quality of life piece. We can only frame ourselves in the negative. Someone's suffering, something's miserable, someone's ill, someone's sick. We can't yet enter, we can't yet flesh out what's wonderful, what's beautiful, what people might be seeking versus fleeing. I don't
Yeah,
know. It's just kind of fascinating, but it's true. And there's nothing in the Articles of Confederation of our field, of our subject matter, that limits us to this pathological or medical model. I would love it if palliative care
absolutely.
was a movement that included architects, designers, artists, anyone interested in making life more beautiful and less difficult, you might say, or not even less difficult, just navigating the difficulties.
Yeah, yeah,
The subject matter is so
yeah.
big, so beautiful. It has the potential to cast such a inclusive family, but we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that so the public health approach to palliative care, which is where this all comes from, and compassionate community is part of that, is absolutely not a deficit pathological model. It is
Right.
about the love, laughter, and friendship. It's about so we ask the question about what does a good life mean, and how
Yeah.
can we frame what we do to help you live a good life. And when we're talking about you, we're not just talking about the person with the illness, we're talking about the whole caring network and the
You
community
got it.
and the workplaces and to civic structures, and it's everything
Amen.
inclusive. So, yeah.
Yes.
So it sounds like, it seems to me we could probably talk for hours on this subject, but
Yes.
I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, which has been great. But are there things that we've missed? Anything that you think we should talk about
Hmm.
before we come to the final bit?
Gosh, man, no, we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, obviously, some of these are tips of icebergs that we could drill down on, but yeah, we'd need a few more days. No, I love I love what we've covered. Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, great. Well, it's been terrific, and I love to hear
Mm,
your experience. And what I think what's particularly nice is the commonalities that we have. Finding
mhm,
those similar experiences and
mm,
about why we're in medicine and how we practice it and all of that. It's been great, and
mhm,
yeah, that's terrific. So I have three questions I ask all my guests at the
mhm,
end. And the first one is, tell me about a moment when the smallest thing made the biggest difference.
hmm. Well, there would be a lot vying for that one. It's often the smallest little things. I can't tell you how many times someone holding a door open or just flashing a smile, a stranger, a little wave when they let you when you let them pass or they let you pass, or just some little moment that breaks the ice or breaks the plane of distance. This sort of get the feeling that most of us walk around sort of like in saran wrap, like we can see each other, but we're not really touching each other in so many ways. And so when someone punctures that, it's often unexpected. It could be a teller at the grocery store who just dares to make a lot of eye contact and just makes my day, just makes everything just feel fine. All the running around in my head, all that junk flying around, it just cuts right through it. So I don't even know if that's a real answer to your question, but that's where my mind goes. Yeah.
It's a perfect answer. And I'll tell you why, because we talk about this a lot. And in particular, because those small moments, they're little explosions of compassion. They're
Mm,
little ripples of compassion,
mm,
and they are accompanied by a release of oxytocin.
mhm,
And the curious thing about that is that okay, well, look, if you look for oxytocin, you find it throughout the animal kingdom, and that means that there's an evolutionary pressure to be kind, and
mhm,
human beings are the most social of animals, and survival of the kindest is why we called the podcast
mhm,
that. Because and in those small moments, those multiple small moments, when you like exactly like you say, when you go down the shops, and that you have just a nice conversation with somebody, if somebody holds the door open for you, the smile, or it's like a little this
mhm,
little explosion takes place, and it happens. You can actually, I mean, in the model that we have developed, we've built on that as a deliberate act and
mm,
trained people in the community to be community connectors, specifically for the purpose of that listening, that kindness, that small act of walking around in the town of Frome and knowing that people are looking out for you. And I
mhm,
think you've described it really perfectly. And the flip side of that is, it's a recurrent theme that we've had on the podcast, and I think it's you've already spoken about this is how. So Diane Roberts, for example, was talking about she's somebody of Afro-Caribbean origin who is now lives in Canada. And growing up as a child and being one of the few black people in her community, like just walking down the street, and there are some people who grip their purse a little bit more tightly as you
mhm,
see as you walk by,
mhm.
and it's a kind of opposite of that. And I think that's probably an experience that you've had
Mm.
repeatedly. which is a
Absolutely.
disconnection rather than a connection. And I can really see why a connection is like just a moment of connection, a moment of kindness. See beyond the mask, see beyond the relative framework of the casing in which we carry ourselves, and connect with that kindness. So I think it's a perfect answer. I really like that. The smallest things that always make the biggest difference.
Hmm.
Uh, the second question is, what's your favorite public moment of compassion?
Hmm. Well, because we kind of took my answer would might blur into our first answer too. I love the public, like there are times where someone falls down or something happens on the street and like you're describing, we all just keep moving. There are times I remember when I was visiting my parents in St. Louis, who that's where they live now, and not too long ago, and where that the paradox of America is very obvious. Some of the kindest people you'll meet, and some of the harshest sort of policies at the same time. But I was recently in St. Louis and saw people of different colors. One person had broken down on the side of the road, and multiple people pulled over to help. Strangers, as I was watching this, I was at a park. I was watching this. How many people came to the person's rescue? Of different colors, of different shapes, of different backgrounds. And in that little moment of that person changing a tire on the side of the road, who was a little precariously out in the middle of the road, all that shit just fell away. Not shit, I don't mean that. I mean,
Yeah,
but that stuff just fell. The differences, the distinctions between people
yeah,
fell away immediately, and people just dropped whatever they're doing to help this person out in a non-fussy way. No one was asking for a trophy. I just happened to be watching it. it and that, everyone would go was going to go on their way at some point, and no one would have made there would be no articles written about that exchange. But
yeah,
I've not seen a more potent, compassionate moment. And the thought that these are happening all the time and don't get recognition, don't get seen, are so that's also kind of very compelling and beautiful and worth reminding ourselves. It reminds me of one last thing to say about that. It's kind of related. I remember hearing a lecture when I was younger. I think it was by Deepak Chopra, actually. We don't, he's kind of gone a guru pathway, but I think he said some pretty wise things. And one of the things I heard him say was, and I try to follow this, is when someone sneezes, um, just say bless you to yourself. Don't even, you don't have to say it out loud, but just feel the bless, acknowledge that person sneeze somehow, bless it somehow. And I've taken that, for me, is now a practice of when I see someone, a stranger on the street, having something, they're having fun, something's going well. If I'm not careful, if I'm in a bad mood, their fun is obnoxious to me. Like,
yeah,
and I catch myself and I watch myself try. I try to just, can I be happy for that person being happy right now
yeah,
on
yeah, yeah.
some teeny little level inside? So I know that's a tangent here, but I think they're related.
Well, it kind of there's something that I wrote. It definitely related. So I wrote this book about, called The Compassion Project, which is about
Mm,
all that happened in Froome. And one of the things that we say in that book is that we swim in a sea of compassion. And
mm,
if you actually look at what goes on in our life, that every time you hold the door open to somebody, every time you wash up, every time you make a cup of tea, every time you have a meal, every time you smile at somebody, every time you do things for your kids or for the person you love, or these compassionate acts of kindness are
mhm,
going on the whole time,
mhm,
and we don't register them. We don't think
mhm,
they're there. It comes back to, are we looking at deficits or are we looking at assets? But
mhm,
I think the first step of the journey to being more compassionate is recognizing that we are already compassionate, that it's
mhm,
naturally there, and we swim in a sea of it, and if it's not there, we die. It's so
mhm,
fundamental. So I really like the two examples that you've given
mhm.
there. They emphasize this swimming in a sea of compassion, in small
Yeah,
moments, in big moments, in the whole time. Yeah, that's great. And
yeah.
the final question I have is, what matters most to you in your life?
Mm. These are shockingly difficult questions, which is telling.
Good.
You know, you bastard. Because there's a piece of me, and I can't tell which is the realer piece of me that wants to say, I want to love without adjectives. There's no better, there's no worse. I want to love the whole thing. I want to, I want to decondition it. So part of me wants to say something like that. But that's also, I'm aware that as I say that, as much as I believe that and in a way aspire to that, it's also a half answer. I mean, there's another answer might be one way to put it is my relationship with my dog, Maisie. There's nothing more powerful than that relationship. She's sitting right here. I have never experienced a love higher than that. I would go to war for her. When she's around, I fear nothing. I fear nobody. I know she would rip a throat out if she needed to. There's something so wordless and perfect about it. I could live my whole life and maybe 90 years devoted to this animal, and that would be plenty. Um,
And my guess is that this sense of her ripping the throat out of somebody to protect you. She's not a chihuahua.
no, 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 that's a funnier image. She is half pit bull, half German shepherd. Yes, very, very much not a chihuahua. Uh, that's got a Monty Python overlay to it.
Yes. And there's again a curious thing about dogs is that we there's a fantastic book called Survival of the Friendliest, written by
Mm,
Brian Hare and Vanessa Woods, which is
mm,
along very much along these lines. And they start the book by talking about how intelligent dogs are, but not in the way that we think, and
mm,
that dogs actually kindness and friendliness has been a part of how dogs have developed and how humans have developed, and actually
mhm,
we've evolved together. When you trace the anthropological migration of human beings, you find dog
mm.
bones going
Isn't it
with them
amazing?
the whole way.
Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that fact. Yeah.
And anyone who doesn't like dogs, they've got to discover something inside themselves.
I actually kind of believe that. I mean, to each their own and all that, but I actually think people who don't like dogs are on some fundamental level wrong. I mean, that is my bias. But
No, no. I mean, we've always had dogs. I adore dogs, and they're amazing. And in a way, when we're talking about in the context of palliative care, pets play a really important role, because
Mhm.
no matter how you look, and no matter if you haven't washed for a week or two, dogs really like that, and no matter what's happening with your hair, they just love you, and they're just happy to see you, and
Right
that's what a
on.
real friend is. Yeah,
Right on. They're not loving you because they're not spending any time wishing you were someone else or wishing they were someone else. They're not wasting
yeah,
time like that. They see you for what you
that's
are.
it.
And that was amazing. Dog, I had a service dog after I got out of the hospital. And as you can imagine, that relationship was very central to my recovery in exactly that way. I had
Yeah,
this beast looking at me, loving me, even when I was at my lowest. And he wasn't asking me to be anything else. It was wonderful. It was perfect.
yeah. It's a it, that again at the heart of everything, and again, it's something that's come up again and again and again. That these
Mhm.
moments of, it could just be one person or one dog, that moment of love, that moment of it's you, and it's not how you look, it's not how you are, it's you, you
Mhm.
know. And yeah,
Mhm.
so perfect.
Mhm.
Well, look, BJ, it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Mhm.
That's thank you so much for spending the time, and that's it's really fascinating to hear your story and hear how you've moved in the direction that you moved in. So I'm extremely
Mhm.
grateful.
And I to you, Julian. It's been just plain fun talking to you, brother, and fun sharing a weird life story together, an arc together. And here we are across the planet. Pretty cool. So thank you,
That's it.
buddy.